All right, welcome back. I want to do something that I've been promising for the last couple of weeks, and that is to bring you up to speed on some of the latest research that we've been doing. We've been in a project that we've called Discipleship Initiatives with Young Adults. This work has, over the last couple of years, focused on emerging adults. And a particular aspect of emerging adulthood that I think you're going to really resonate with based on the studying that we've been doing together. And that's particularly in this realm of transitions. The discipleship initiatives with young adults that we affectionately call DIA is graciously funded by Lilly Endowment. And we're really glad for the resources to do some creative work to advocate for emerging adults. And so here was our research question. What are the most prevalent transitions young adults encounter as they negotiate an often less defined path from adolescence to adulthood? Now, in this class, you'd read this and go, yeah, that's a great question, right? Given the work that we've been doing. As we think about emerging adults and transitions, the way that we defined transitions was this: the new, challenging, exciting, and disorienting experiences emerging adults encounter as they navigate life changes and make choices to take responsibility for their lives and relationships. These transitions may be experienced as gain, loss, development, or harmonization. Okay, so there's a lot sort of going on here. We know from the work that we have done already that emerging adulthood is in some ways a decade of transition, right? That's the way it's been talked about. But more particularly, it's probably a decade of particular transitions. And again, it doesn't mean that emerging adulthood is a transitional space. A decade is too long. It's its own unique space in the sort of the development of young people toward adulthood. But within emerging adulthood, there seems to be a lot of particular transitions and negotiations that emerging adults are making. And so we've been wondering what that actually all means. Now, we know that young adults, in many ways, emerging adults, are going through vocational transitions. We know that by age 33, only 33% will hold a bachelor's degree. 37% will have completed some college, and about 23% will have completed some high school. So we know that that has an impact on their vocations. They'll hold 8.2 jobs between ages 18 and 32. This age group has lost more jobs and has taken more pay cuts this season than just about any of the generations and age groups in the United States. 1 in 3 have a student debt of $37,000, which is almost $400 a month. 70% of those in their 20s and 30s are entrepreneurs, and 40% of those 70% are actually women, so almost half. And sadly, we still see that women only earn 82 cents for every dollar men make, which is an injustice and something that we have to change. But this raises a question for emerging adults in particular, like, how do I live my 5 to 9 life in a 9 to 5 world, right? Like, emerging adults are oftentimes working not like the typical 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but actually 5 p.m. to 9 a.m., a second job, trying to make ends meet, doing things entrepreneurially, where there isn't necessarily that punch in, punch out mentality. And so work-life balance, whatever that is just like a foreign concept to emerging adults. We also know that when it comes to young adults or emerging adults in relational transitions, those ages 18 and 29 move more than any other of the age categories, as we mentioned before. 52% will live at home with one of their parents. They're going to marry later, and they're less trusting of institutions, including religious ones. Okay, so relationally, we're just sort of seeing some shifts along the way. So a question that often comes up, I think, for emerging adults is, who is my community when my home keeps changing and my presence is short-lived, right? Like, if I'm only going to be around a year, like, what does it mean for me to invest in a community? Is that even possible? What does the community expect of me? What can I really give? Do I really want to do that? Because it's hard to say goodbye. And then when we think about emerging adults and spiritual transitions, we recognize the fact that, and you've heard me say this before, our faith journeys must negotiate new information and experiences to recalibrate our quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. Our life rhythms don't match church rhythms. We've already talked about that. 29% of Americans and 35% of younger millennials identify as none, yet most of them are theists, right? So we have this rising category of the nothing in particulars when it comes to how people identify, say, a religious affiliation. But we recognize also that a lot of those non-affiliates, the nuns as they are called, actually are theists. And so there still is this instinct toward some sort of belief in God or a higher power, but they're just not connecting necessarily with institutions. I think that what we've learned through the literature is that our lack of attendance doesn't reflect our desire for participation. Like attendance and participation actually are different for emerging adults. And I think they're asking the question, who's going to walk or even change with us? As we journey with our faith and doubt journeys, right? And this is what we've been talking about before with faith and doubt. And so, again, I think as you've heard me say this before, how does my spirituality keep up with my increasingly complex in motion world? These, I think, are oftentimes the pressing questions that emerging adults have. So when we look at that and we think about the quests that they're on, there is a lot of transition. We know that identity, belonging, and purpose and the questions that come with that often drive these things. So as you learn from the definition that I just gave you about transitions, transition isn't necessarily something that's done to an emerging adult. Oftentimes, it is actually evoked by the emerging adult as they pursue their identity, belonging, and purpose, as they take a risk by taking a job or investing in a relationship or moving across the country or trying something new. You see? So transition happens sometimes because of a circumstance that happens in their life, and sometimes it happens because they've actually evoked the circumstance. And so we want to pay attention to that. And so what we did is we set out by doing an emerging adult and transitions literature review, which I'll explain in a second. We then did a young adult national survey and interviews, and then we did a young adult ministry ecology. A lot of times you're going to see in this slide deck, young adult versus emerging adult. I ascribe to emerging adult, but the project that Lily invited us into is the Young Adult Initiative. And so Lily uses young adult, so a lot of times we'll use emerging and young interchangeably simply because of that. And they're the donor, and just want to be respectful of the way that they're using their terminology. And this is actually true in a lot of churches, right? We don't use emerging adulthood. We've talked about this. We use young adult. So just know that I'm using these interchangeably. Here. So when it comes to the literature review, here's some things that we know. We spent over 400 hours doing research with over 94, now like about 100 articles and chapters review. These were published between 2015 to present, about 2023. So this is before, during, and after the pandemic. The range that we looked at were those between ages 18 and 29. And we also really looked for racial and ethnic diversity in the work that we did and what the literature has shown. And that came up with, resulted in a 54-page report. And we discovered that we think there were actually 7 key transitions that emerging adults may likely experience sometime in their emerging adult phases. Now, that's pretty exciting. Like out of that huge sort of chart that I showed you with all those things going on, we think that they actually kind of descend or kind of culminate around like orbit around 7 transitions. And so this was quite exciting. Now, as we thought about that, we then said, well, we got to sort of test this this framework. Like just because the literature says it's true doesn't necessarily mean it is true. So then we conducted a national survey. This was ages 23 to 29. You may be wondering why not 18 to 29. It's because, again, the grant that we got was for 23 to 29-year-olds. So this survey is just leaning a little bit older than starting at 18, but it's still in the realm of emerging adulthood. So they're 23 to 29. They identified as Christian from any tradition. They lived in the United States, and they said to have experienced a memorable change or transition in their 20s. Those are the criteria that basically they had to get through the gates they had to get to actually take the survey that we did. In the end of the day, we surveyed 1,044 emerging adults across the country. Our goals here were pretty aggressive in that we wanted something that was racially and ethnically representative. And so you see here that we have the percentages of the 2020 census on race and ethnicity. We also have the 2060 census, race, and ethnicity. This is what's projected. And then what we tried to do was try to hit something that was closer to the 2060 census, race, and ethnicity. So our baseline was 2020. Our goal was 2060. And then what we did our best to try to do that. And as you can see through the yellow, that we did fairly well. We are right on track with just about every category. The only one that's maybe underrepresented a little bit is actually white here. When we looked at also regions, you can see this is pretty representative of populations across the United States. And so it's represented from that perspective. When we looked at where emerging adults live, from rural to small town to large city and suburb, again, you'll see the distribution is representative. We also had a pretty good distribution of men, women, and those that identified as some other descriptor. And so that is representative as well. And then as far as education level, I think we were really excited about this. You'll see here that it's almost a bit of a bell curve associated with how people have some education or not. And I think this is really, really crucial. As you have probably read from some of the works from our class, there's often a lot of times a lot of articles and research that is focused on the educated emerging adult, the college student. They're an easy and accessible population to tap into, but sometimes there is the forgotten half. And I think that we've done a good job in this survey to represent all types of emerging adults. When it came to Christian tradition, we had about 64% Protestant, a third Catholic, and then also Orthodox. And when we asked them about like their religious attendance, here they said about 12% was once more than once a week. Another 30% was once a week. And then you can see everything from once or twice a month to none to never associated here. But then we also asked them about their participation, right? Like, how do they participate in church? And what's interesting is about half said, well, we go to congregational services, but a lot just go to like a young adult service or a small group, or they serve. And then some just say, well, I don't really have any participation with a religious organization. And that 30%, if you remember, sort of echoes the other slide that I showed you about the nuns being around, 30 to 35%. We also know that when it came to the importance of religion and spirituality, it's interesting to notice here that about 24% said it was extremely important. But if we were to look at all of this, we begin to see that from moderately up, we probably have about 90% of those who identify as Christian. They aren't necessarily, they could be affiliated in a lot of different ways, but they said it's relatively important to them. Okay. Now, again, they identify as Christian, but it's still a pretty broad swath of people that we surveyed here. And it seems as though spirituality and religion is somehow important to them, which we thought was really, really interesting. So, as we think about that, I think what we can say is with our survey sample, that young adults seem to care about their religion and spirituality in some ways. They come from all different types of walks of life. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, that as we think about the diversity and the multiplicity of emerging adults, they come from different places. But we hope that this methodology allows us, as we gather the data, to test our hunches about transitions with a representative sample. And so I just wanted to give you a framework of the methodology for this particular section. And I would just ask yourself, like, where do you see yourself in the research? You don't have the research questions in front of you. I haven't given you those. I haven't given you the survey. But as you look, if you go back and you look at the different graphs that I've shown you here, like, where would you fall in here? And I hope that perhaps that would be something for you to reflect on. So anyway, that's the methodology. Super important to me to share with you. And then in the next video, I want to share you some of the findings. So we'll see you in the next video.